Hello and welcome to Northern Nightmares. As always, I'm your host Andrew, and welcome to this week's episode. But before we begin, how's everyone doing lately? Feel like we haven't talked in a while. I hope everyone is still enjoying the show. We're officially on episode 35. It's crazy to think that this podcast is now 10 months old. And in saying that, I wanted to mention something about season 2. The past 14 episodes I had first planned for this season. I chose to cover a range of topics to display what this show can do and what I myself enjoy covering. We are now officially done 1/3 of this season, and the next phase, you're going to see some real heinous, grisly stories. I'd say at least the next dozen episodes I've planned out are mainly true crime, and most of them are strictly in Canada. For the other ones, I have some dark historical tales that will surely unsettle you. And as I'm looking at my schedule, I can tell you as well, I only have one palate cleanser story. So as for this episode, we start this week off with a tragic but grisly event. If you have any fears of flying or have a weak stomach, I would advise skipping this one. Listener discretion is strongly advised. On September 2nd, 1998, Swissair Flight 111 had left John F. Kennedy International Airport and was scheduled to go to Geneva, Switzerland. The flight had a total of 229 people, 215 passengers, and 14 crew members. What should have been a regular red-eye flight would turn into a tragedy. After taking off, this plane would only be in the air for at least an hour and 13 minutes before a fire broke out inside the roof of the plane, which would cause the plane's computers to shut down, malfunction, and inevitably crash. This is the tragic tale of the crash Swissair Flight 111 and how it landed in the waters of St. Margaret's Bay, Nova Scotia. There's a lot of details to cover in this story, so what I'll be doing is splitting everything up in a few parts. First, a full description of the crew, the plane, and a bit about Swissair. The second part will be looking at a detailed timeline of what was happening in the hour while in the air, following with the crash site, the recovery mission, and some grisly details. And then I'll be breaking down the investigation and what the initial cause was. And lastly, we'll end the story with the aftermath. Since 1931 until 2001, Swissair was one of the major international airlines in the world, often considered the flying bank in the industry, as the company was quite financially stable. It was also thought as the national symbol for Switzerland. However, during the late 80s and into the 90s, Swissair took on a disastrous goal, which they wanted to expand into other countries by acquiring smaller airlines. This was called the Hunter strategy. They were trying to merge with other airlines like Air France and British Airlines, as they wanted to be Europe's major airline. However, with all the over-expanding they were doing, resources were starting to dry up. A recession had kicked in during the 90s when fuel prices had spiked. Swissair was getting desperate for income, and they were determined, though, to get their income wherever and however they could. They decided to incorporate an early version of the in-flight entertainment systems into their fleet. Passengers could watch movies, television, video games, and paid services in the form of gambling. This system was designed by a Vegas corporation, and no shocker there, where passengers could play electronic games while enjoying their flight amongst the clouds. Now this was only available in the business class section of the plane, and I want you to remember that because we're going to come back to it a little bit later. The aircraft was a McDonnell Douglas MD-11. It was a tri-jet wide-body plane. The MD-11 was the largest of its kind, and it was equipped with 3 Pratt & Whitney PW4462 turbofan engines, and the Flight 111 had logged about 36,041 hours of flight time. It was a 7-year-old plane with the name Schaffenhausen until 1993, when it was renamed Vaude. It could hold 241 passengers, but for this flight, only 215 were abroad. Now, the captain that helmed this flight was a 49-year-old Ernst Zimmermann. He had logged approximately 10,800 total flying time hours. 900 of those hours were with the MD-11. Before flying for Swissair, Zimmermann was a fighter pilot for the Swiss Air Force between the years of 1966 to 1970. He was also an instructor for the MD-11, teaching up and upcoming pilots. Zimmermann's first officer for this flight was 36-year-old Stefan Loh. Loh had logged in approximately 4,800 hours. 200 of those hours were with the MD-11. Loh was an instructor for the McDonnell Douglas MD-80 aircraft and the Airbus A320. Loh was also a pilot in the Air Force between 1982 and 1990. Now, for the cabin crew, there was a pursuer, 11 flight attendants, and everyone was fully certified, qualified, and fully trained with Swiss regulations under the Joint Aviation Authorities, or the JAA. This flight was scheduled to leave JFK International Airport a little after 8 p.m. on September 2nd, 1998. It was a red-eye flight heading for Geneva, Switzerland. The skies were deemed clear with no issues in sight for the flight. Like I said before, this flight had 215 passengers, including 14 crew members, making a grand total of 229 people. For the cargo hold, the luggage had been packed, as well as some interesting items, like a painting called The Painter made by Pablo Picasso, a kilo of diamonds, 2 kilos of Swiss watches and jewelry. There was also 50 kilos of currency bonds for a bank located in Switzerland. That's about a couple pounds in jewelry and about 110 pounds in bonds. Everything was going to be smooth sailing, nothing out of the ordinary, just a standard overnight flight. But let's look at what took place during Flight 111's time in the sky before its unfortunate doom. The flight took off at 8:18 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 12:18 Universal Time. Sometime between 8:30 and 8:47, the aircraft experienced radio blackout for at least 13 minutes. This was due to communication radio tuning issues. It seemed the crew had trouble switching channels, but it was quickly fixed. Switching over to Atlantic Standard Time, it was 52 minutes after taking off. At 10:10 p.m., the flight crew in the cockpit detected an unusual odor. They figured it might have been smoke coming from the AC system. At 10:12 p.m., the crew considered making a landing in possibly Bangor, Maine, or Boston, Massachusetts. At 10:14, the odor had increased in smell and smoke was visible. The crew then declared pan, an international signal that indicates a problem. However, it's not an emergency or life-threatening. They were communicating with Mountain Air Traffic Control, as they were the main hub for flights over Nova Scotia. The aircraft was 33,000 feet in the sky at this time. Zimmermann requested permission to land in Boston. At 10:16, the crew in the cockpit put on their oxygen masks and started to turn towards Boston. Now currently, the smoke is only in the cockpit. The rest of the plane had no idea what was going on, so to keep the situation calm, passengers were unaware of the preceding events. The pilot, at this time, was advised to head to Halifax instead of Boston as it was closer. Boston was about 433 kilometers, or 269 miles behind them, and Halifax was 122 kilometers, 76 miles ahead of them. At 10:18, Moncton then handed over communications to Halifax International Airport, where at the ATC connected with 111. Now, the aircraft at this point had been descending, and at 10:20 they were about 21,000 feet. The crew requested more flight distance was needed to safely drop down further, since they were now 35 miles, 55 kilometers from Halifax. At 10:21, 111 requested a fuel dump before landing, so they would have less weight before touching down. A fuel dump is necessary for a safe landing, as it means the aircraft is above its maximum landing weight. If a fuel dump didn't happen, this could cause damage to the landing gear, the wings, or even the fuselage because of too much weight coming down all at once. After 111 requested this, they were instructed to head south towards St. Margaret's Bay, where it would have been safe for the fuel dump. Now, the crew then shut off power to the cabin, as according to Swissair checklist involving smoke from an unknown origin, the crew were hoping to stop the fire from reaching more of the cockpit. So, all of the passengers were in complete darkness when this happened. This situation was getting worse though, and I'm sure everyone was asking what was going on. However, when the crew turned this off, it also turned off the recirculating fans in the cabin, allowing the fire to spread directly to the cockpit. This would shut off the autopilot, and at 10:24, crew declared a state of emergency and must manually fly the plane. At 10:25 p.m., Halifax had lost contact with Flight 111. The black box stopped recording at this time. The aircraft's transponder briefly resumed transmission, though, of the radar. This indicated the plane was at 9,700 feet at this time. After this, though, the plane could only be tracked via the primary radar system. However, it doesn't provide altitude info. At 10:31 p.m., Flight 111 had crashed into the water near St. Margaret's Bay, almost upside down. Now, a person can deal with a couple G's, which is gravitational force. Between 4 to 6 G's, a person can pass out. Fighter pilots can withstand up to 8 or 9 G's because of their equipment. The highest recorded G's someone had survived is 46.2, and it was achieved by Air Force Officer John Stapp during a test. The impact from the crash of 111 caused everyone to deal with an approximate 350 G's. This killed everyone instantaneously. However, I wish I could tell you that it was a clean death, but unfortunately, this next part of the story gets dark. So I'm advising you now, the details of the crash are very extreme. I will proceed over them respectfully, but I'm not going to sugarcoat it. So let's now look into what happened during the recovery of 111. I will say right off the bat, there are details in this part that will be unsettling. When I get to that, I will give you one last trigger warning so that you can skip ahead a few minutes. When 111 hit the water, it was going at an estimated 345 miles per hour, 555 kilometers per hour. The impact was so powerful that a seismographic recorded in Halifax and Moncton felt the shock waves. Like I also just mentioned, the plane was hit with approximate 350 G-forces, to which this decimated the plane and everyone inside. But I'll get to the passengers in a moment. Upon impact, the Joint Rescue Coordination Center, Halifax, or JRCC Halifax, was dispatched immediately to the site. They named this search and rescue mission Operation Persistence. Over 1,000 members of the Canadian military was also involved, to which included the Royal Canadian Air Force, the Royal Canadian Navy, and the Canadian Army. Many members of the Canadian Coast Guard, CCG, and the Canadian Coast Guard Auxiliary, CCGA, were also in attendance. There was also 450 RCMP and over 2,400 Canadian Armed Forces. The United States and the Red Cross was also involved with the operation. Local fishermen and boaters were also there to aid, as a lot of them were part of the CCGA. Now, it's often a misconception that the plane had hit Peggy's Cove, but it actually was near Bayswater. Peggy's Cove was just one of the base of operations for the whole mission. 21 emergency units were dispatched as well from Halifax, the South Shore, and Annapolis Valley. An EHS helicopter was also on site to transport anyone to the Queen Elizabeth II Health Sciences Center in Halifax, as this hospital was put on a full emergency alert. Now, for land and shoreline searches, this was the responsibility of Halifax Regional Search and Rescue. They were taking care of all the ground operations that included military and other organizations within HRM. By the afternoon of September 3rd, though, it was determined that there was no survivors. Upon impact, the aircraft broke apart. Debris sank into the ocean. Pieces washed up on shore, and over the next few weeks, pieces continued to wash up on other shorelines. Trigger warning now. The unsettling details are next, and if you don't like grisly details, skip now. And if you are deciding to venture onward, I'd advise not eating for this part. I'm sorry. The debris of the plane wasn't the only thing that was found during the investigation. When the plane hit the water, with a combination of speed and the G-forces I had mentioned, it broke the plane apart. For the passengers, this would disintegrate them instantaneously and killing everyone. Now, I wish I could say the fire and impact incinerated them to ashes. Unfortunately, that's not what happened. The victims had died instantly, so I think they would never have felt what was coming. Due to the extreme speed and force, the bodies were deboned. This is when the skin is separated from the bones. Muscles, skin, everything is ripped and shredded due to the extreme deceleration and impact. Once the body loses its skeleton, the support for everything else is gone, which results in the separation of the limbs and other body parts. During the rescue of 111, as I said, the plane debris wasn't the only thing they found. 15,000 body parts were scattered everywhere. I found an article written by a writer named Nancy Robb. She had done a 3-page piece about John Butt, Nova Scotia's chief medical examiner during this time. Butt had thought that what could have been a 3-day trip for him turned into 3 weeks. He was tasked to identify everything with his team at the CFB Shearwater base. Butt had said at least 90 people were identified through dental records, 30 through fingerprints and antemortem x-rays. More than 100 people were through DNA analysis. Authorities throughout 12 countries in Western Europe had to search victims' homes for any form of DNA to be sent to Nova Scotia. Everything was sorted in 4 categories: visually identifiable part, large but unidentifiable, and small but unidentifiable. One example of what was found: the impact broke jawbones apart. Upper and lower jaws were separated and scattered. Pelvises and lower limbs completely broken down to pieces. Fractured or dismembered feet, and sometimes just an arm would remain. Everything that was found was placed in bags, stored in refrigerators on cargo trucks, and transported to the bases. At least 1,370 DNA samples were processed. Dr. John Butt had expressed the unsettling and difficult task of having to tell families that only a piece or pieces remained of their loved ones. Having the manifest and some passports that were recovered helped in some way with the daunting task. Everyone involved with the rescue mission suffered from the effects caused by the scene. That involves Butt's medical team. Every military personnel, Coast Guards, and even volunteers had dealt with PTSD from it. To even today, I would say there was a lot of people that probably still refuse to talk about what was seen. I had found one account of a medical examiner on Butt's team stating they just zoned out while looking at the body parts, basically working on autopilot, the mind shutting off the fact that these were once people at a time. I can't imagine what these heroes had dealt with during this time and are probably still dealing with today. My thoughts and condolences to all the brave men and women that were out there. I will put a link down in the show notes if you want to read more on the article of Dr. John Butt's account of this time. Well, now let's move past this part and focus on the biggest question. Like, how did this happen? What caused the fire? Well, after many hours, days, and weeks, the debris from the plane was put back together in one way so they could have found the cause. Let's now move into the next part, which is the investigation. Most of the debris that was recovered and located was underwater, at least 55 meters, 180 feet down. Like I mentioned earlier, the rest was floating and had washed up on shorelines. Divers had performed many trips below the ocean, recovering everything they could. We had vessels like the Canadian Coast Guard ship, the Hudson, the USS Grapple, and the HMSCS Anticosti, and many Halifax-class frigates. By October 21st, at least 21% of debris was recovered from the ocean. It's not an easy task recovering this. For one thing, it's dark down there. Divers are literally combing every section of the ocean floor. Plus, it's a slow, patient work having to haul up all the heavy parts. But in the end, they reconstructed the plane. At least 2 million pieces of debris was recovered and brought ashore. Everything was transported to a marine industrial park in Sheet Harbor. That's about east of Halifax and northeast of the downtown core. It's here that everything was sorted before being transported to the final destination. That includes the plane debris, the luggage, the personal effects, and the human remains. Everything that was inspected by over 350 investigators from many organizations and companies. The list includes the Transportation Safety Board of Canada, the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board, the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration, the Swiss Aircraft Accidental Investigation Bureau, Boeing, Pratt & Whitney, Airline Pilots Association, and, of course, Swissair. After everything was sorted, the plane debris was moved to CFB Shearwater. Now, every piece was freshly cleaned. It was then sorted, weighted, and then placed in a specific area of the hangar. This is usually a grid system, which is layered out to represent sections of the plane. Anything that was determined to be non-essential to the investigation was placed in large boxes. Everything was documented, photographed, and stored where appropriate. Anything that had burn marks, heat damage, or unusual qualities was given full attention. The front of the plane, the cockpit, and everything to the front of the first-class passenger cabin was fully reconstructed, as it was thought that this was the starting point of the fire. When the black box had shut off before the crash, there was about 6 minutes of unknown information. Investigators had to find physical evidence of what happened in that time. This added a level of significant complexity. This was the most expensive investigation in Canadian history, costing around $57 million or $48.5 million in US dollars over 5 years. Now, the cause of the fire was because of an electrical arcing that occurred above the ceiling on the right side to the rear wall of the cockpit. The arc had ignited a piece of flammable material on a nearby covering, which was on what is called an insulation blanket. Now, kind of in simple terms, it was a type of insulation that protects the inner workings of the plane from moisture, oxygen, and light. Everything in that area went up in a matter of minutes. But what caused it? Well, let's backtrack for a minute. Remember when I was describing the on-flight entertainment system? More specifically, the interactive games? Yeah, let's dive back to that for a moment. So, to run such a system, each passenger would have a computer underneath their seat. However, since this was a separate system that wasn't in the plane's original blueprints, there was bound to be some bugs. And that bug was a steep bill in the form of power. If you were around during the 90s, you might remember that computers weren't tiny like the ones in our pockets. Computers then were a literal box weighing at least 15, sometimes even 20 pounds, and needed many cables to run, especially in this case on the airplane. Because this system was installed long after the plane was built, it would draw a large amount of power that were beyond the engineer's plans for non-essential cabins. Swissair had added one of these systems to the airplane that would be Flight 111 and the rest of their fleet for the MD-11 models. When investigators looked into the IFE system, they couldn't determine which wire was the origins of the fire, but it was due to the massive draw of power from the Gamley system. Also, investigators looked at other Swiss airplanes that had the same system and noticed every wire setup to run the IFE was different. It was determined that installation instructions were incomplete for the IFE. It didn't show how technicians were supposed to route several of the major power cables. The installers had to make decisions themselves, often jerry-rigging the system or slapping it together and saying done. I don't think the handyman's secret weapon of duct tape would have worked either. Investigators even figured out that the installers had no experience with the MD-11 planes. The IFE was connected to an electric bus. Normally, it should have shut down the cabin power when too much power was being drawn, but in this case, it failed to shut down, and it's thought that this is one of the factors that caused the wire to arc. In the end, the IFE system was poorly installed. Different aircraft had a different layout for the cables and wire. The whole thing had questionable connections, inadequate protection against rubbing. In times when fires would, happen on airplanes, is usually in spots where a fire suppression system can take care of it. For this case, the fire was in a hidden section of the cockpit where a fire system wasn't built. So even if the crew got fire extinguishers to fight it, it would have been hard to reach anyways, or even try to find. Now here's the interesting part of the story. No one was held accountable for the plane crash, as it wasn't one person's mistake, but the result of a chain of failures. Flammable materials approved by regulators, hidden electrical hazards, inadequate certificate standards, and aircraft designs that gave the crew almost no warning and no way to fight the fire above them. No individual was held legally responsible, but the crash had changed aircraft fire safety standards around the world. Now, Swissair responded quickly to the whole ordeal. They transported families, friends, and anyone connected with the victims to Nova Scotia. They provide counseling, financial advances, and direct access to airline officials. Its immediate humanitarian response was widely regarded as compassionate. But as the tragedy moved into the course of the year, the relationship became more complicated, with compensation disputes, confidential settlements, and some families feeling excluded from the important decisions. Now, prior to this, I did mention Swissair was struggling financially. Flight 111 didn't bankrupt the company, but it was one of the defining tragedies that started to put the nail in their coffin. Swissair continued to operate till 2001. They did go bankrupt around this time because of financial mismanagements, and the airline business took a downturn for a while post 9/11. Swissair grounded their entire fleet as of October 2001, ending their 70-year run in the airline business. Now, the aftermath of the crash was one to be remembered. On September 9th, 1998, a major memorial service was held for the victims. I had mentioned that Swissair had flown in the families of the victims for this event. It was held at the East St. Margaret's Elementary School in Indian Harbour. Among those attending were Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, Premier Russell McClellan, Swiss President Flavio Cotti, and about 175 family members of the victims. The service included prayers from several faiths, music by local children, and moments of remembrance for all 229 victims. After extensively consulting with the victims' families, the Nova Scotia government made 3 permanent memorials. The first is the Whale's Back near Peggy's Cove, overlooking the crash site. Bayswater, there's a memorial where the unidentified remains were found, and the actual crash site about 11 kilometers offshore. It was designed as a place of remembrance. Swissair Flight 111 claimed the lives of 229 lives, but in the days that followed, the people of Nova Scotia showed the world that humanity looks like in the face of unimaginable loss. Along the shores of St. Margaret's Bay, where the sea met the sky, strangers became family, and their compassions became part of the legacy of Flight 111. And that is the end of our story this week. If you have any stories you wish for me to cover for future episodes, feel free to email me at northernnightmares@outlook.com and hit that subscribe button to get notified when new episodes drop. Next week's episode will take us to the province of Quebec. For this true crime story, I'd say it's one of the most horrifying stories I will have covered. But more on that later. This is your home for nightmarish stories throughout Canada and beyond. I'll see you soon. Sweet dreams, and remember, nightmares are closer than you think.